Some Zorin OS download data suggests that Windows might be losing its stranglehold.
Zorin OS says nearly 1 million downloads after its latest release. Almost 800,000 came from Windows users.
Nearly 1 million downloads. That is what Zorin OS pulled in following its latest release.
Zorin OS 18 is the new and upcoming release of the free and open source Linux operating system, designed to offer a familiar environment for users transitioning from Windows.
And here is the number that should sit on every Microsoft executive's desk as a permanent reminder of what their product decisions have cost them. Out of those 1 million downloads, approximately 800,000 came directly from Windows users. Not from Linux enthusiasts switching distributions. Not from developers exploring alternatives. From ordinary Windows users, office workers, retirees, students, parents with older laptops, people who had never once thought about operating systems as a conscious choice, who downloaded Zorin OS, installed it on their machines, and walked away from Windows. In significant numbers. In a compressed window of time. Following a specific Microsoft decision that converted years of quietly accumulated frustration into an active, irreversible exodus. The timing was not coincidental. The moment Microsoft's October 2025 Windows 10 end-of-life deadline made staying on a familiar, functional operating system a security risk, Zorin OS was there. Familiar enough to feel safe, clean enough to feel like an upgrade, and accessible enough that people who had never touched Linux in. Their lives were fully functional within hours of installation. 800,000 Windows users in one migration wave. This is not a niche story about open source enthusiasts. This is a story about trust, broken at scale, and a platform that was ready to catch the people it lost. Nobody ever loved Windows. That is the foundational truth that makes what happened so significant. No one had a Windows poster on their wall. Nobody felt genuine emotion about File Explorer. The relationship between Windows and its billion-plus users was never built on affection or enthusiasm. It was built on something more durable and more dangerous to lose: dependency through reliability. Windows worked on virtually every piece of hardware ever manufactured. It ran virtually every piece of software ever written. When you bought a computer, turned it on, and Windows appeared on the screen, you trusted that everything would function the way it always had. You trusted that the update waiting for you would make things more stable rather than less. You trusted that the settings you configured would remain configured. You trusted that the operating system running on your machine was, in some fundamental sense, working for you. That trust, not love, not passion, not enthusiasm, but the deep functional trust that comes from consistent reliability over 30 years was the actual foundation of Microsoft's dominance. And it is the thing that Windows 11 has been systematically eroding, update by update, forced change by forced change. Until the October 2025 deadline created the moment where the erosion became a fracture visible enough to drive 800. 0 people to download an alternative in a single release cycle. When something you have trusted unconditionally for 30 years stops feeling trustworthy, the emotional shift is not gradual. It arrives suddenly. Not because a single event caused it, but because a single event revealed what had been building underneath. Windows 11 was that event for millions of users. The hardware requirement that started the trust fracture needs to be understood precisely for what it was. Because the language Microsoft used to describe it was technical, while the decision underneath it was commercial. TPM 2.0 chips. Specific processor generations, minimum hardware specifications that had nothing to do with whether a machine could run Windows 11, and everything to do with Microsoft's hardware refresh cycle strategy. Machines that ran Windows 10 without any performance issues for years were officially declared incompatible. Not because they lacked the processing power. Not because they would struggle with the software demands. Because Microsoft drew a hardware line in the sand that conveniently rendered hundreds of millions of functioning computers officially unsupported. Machines purchased as recently as 2018 and 2019. Machines running every task their owners needed. Machines with nothing physically wrong with them. All officially declared finished. The language used was the language of system requirements. Neutral, technical, unemotional. The experience of receiving that message on a computer that still worked perfectly was not neutral. It was the experience of being told that a product you owned and relied on was being taken from you on a schedule that served someone else's commercial interests. People noticed the difference between those two things. The recognition that the TPM requirement was a policy decision dressed up as a technical one planted the seed of genuine distrust that the subsequent Windows 11 experience then watered consistently. Then came the October 2025 deadline. Windows 10 support ended. No more security patches, no more vulnerability fixes, no more updates of any kind. Microsoft offered paid extended support for businesses, but ordinary users faced an ultimatum with no comfortable exits. Buy new hardware to meet Windows 11's requirements. Pay for extended support that itself expired. Upgrade to an operating system that felt increasingly alien and increasingly hostile. Or stay on an unprotected platform and accept the security risk of running software whose vulnerabilities were now publicly known with no fixes coming. For the first time in 3 decades, Microsoft was not offering Windows users an upgrade. They were issuing a deadline with consequences attached. The psychology of that moment matters independently of the technical reality. People accept change. They resist compulsion. Microsoft turned an upgrade into an ultimatum and activated exactly the emotional response that compulsion produces. Not compliance, but resistance and the urgent search for alternatives. And what 800,000 of them found when they searched was Zorin OS. The deterioration of the day-to-day Windows experience that preceded the October deadline had been accumulating for years in ways that felt individually tolerable but collectively constituted something much larger. Advertising appeared in the start menu of an operating system people had paid for, not on a website supported by advertising, inside the interface of a product whose entire value proposition was supposed to be serving the person using it. Ads in File Explorer. Background telemetry running constantly, collecting behavioral data, hardware usage, application patterns, typing habits. Browsing history, transmitting it to Microsoft servers continuously as a required process that could not be disabled below a mandatory floor, regardless of user preference. Settings configured specifically by users to match their privacy preferences being quietly reset after updates. OneDrive integration redirecting personal files into cloud storage without explicit consent. Microsoft account requirements making local account setup progressively more difficult through installation processes engineered to steer users toward cloud-linked identity rather than local machine ownership. Copilot embedded into Notepad, File Explorer, Paint, and the taskbar as persistent background processes consuming RAM and CPU cycles before a single user application had opened. The recall feature, a system that planned to screenshot everything happening on a user's screen continuously and index it for AI processing, becoming the flashpoint that crystallized everything people had been feeling without being able to articulate. Each of these individually might have been absorbed into the background noise of Windows frustration that users had normalized over years. Together, they formed a pattern whose meaning was impossible to miss once the pattern became clear. Windows was no longer an operating system working for the person using it. It was a corporate platform running on that person's hardware, monetizing their behavior, promoting Microsoft services, and collecting their data on Microsoft's schedule under Microsoft's rules, with no genuine ability for the user to opt out of any of it meaningfully. The computer had stopped feeling like it belonged to the person sitting in front of it. That feeling, the specific recognition that your machine is working for someone else, converts passive frustration into active decision-making in ways that no amount of feature improvement addresses. You cannot fix a trust problem with a feature update. You cannot resolve the feeling of surveillance with a new design language. The only resolution is an operating system that genuinely works for the person using it. And for 800,000 people who downloaded Zorin OS in the wake of the Windows 10 deadline, that is exactly what they found. Understanding why Zorin specifically captured this migration wave requires understanding what ordinary non-technical users are actually afraid of when they consider switching operating systems. The fear is not about software features or technical capability. It is about being lost. The fear of sitting in front of a screen that does not respond the way 30 years of muscle memory expect, of not knowing where things are or what to click, of having to learn something new when the entire motivation for switching was to escape frustration rather than embrace novelty. Every previous wave of Linux advocacy failed to scale beyond the technically curious because it asked users to learn a new system. Zorin asked nothing of the kind. Zorin's design philosophy is built on a single insight that separates it from every other Linux distribution that preceded it. Other distributions built for Linux enthusiasts. Zorin built for Windows refugees. Ubuntu assumes curiosity about Linux. Fedora assumes some technical comfort with the ecosystem. Zorin assumes terror. It assumes that the person installing it has never seen a terminal window, does not want to see a terminal window, and should never be required to. That assumption changes everything about every design decision the platform makes. The taskbar sits at the bottom of the screen where Windows users expect it. The application menu opens from the left corner exactly where the Start button has lived for 30 years. The file manager is organized in folder hierarchies that feel immediately logical to someone coming from Windows Explorer. The Settings panel uses language that assumes no prior Linux knowledge. Applications come pre-installed for common tasks. The installation process guides users through every step with plain language rather than technical prompts. When a Windows.x file is dragged onto a Zorin system, the operating system detects the file type and actively suggests compatible native alternatives from a database of hundreds of applications, eliminating what was historically the most demoralizing moment in the Linux switching experience: the moment where something does not work, and the user has no idea why or what to do next. The result is a system that feels familiar within minutes, not days, and functional within hours rather than weeks. Users who installed Zorin on a Sunday afternoon reported being fully operational on Monday morning without confusion or significant learning curve. The familiarity is not superficial mimicry of Windows aesthetics. It is deep structural familiarity, the same spatial logic, the same interaction patterns, the same organizational principles, underneath an interface that is cleaner and more intentional than what most Windows users had been living with. Zorin Lite deserves specific attention because it directly addresses one of Microsoft's most consequential decisions with targeted precision. When Windows 11 declared hundreds of millions of computers officially incompatible, those machines did not actually stop working. They stopped being supported by Microsoft. They stopped being supported by Microsoft. The hardware was fine. The processor was capable. The RAM was sufficient. The machine could demonstrably handle the computational demands of a modern operating system. It simply lacked a specific security chip that Microsoft decided was mandatory for reasons that served hardware refresh cycle economics as much as any genuine security rationale. Zorin Lite, built on the Ultralight XFC desktop environment, runs on hardware that Windows 11 will not install on. Machines that Windows officially abandoned are running Zorin Lite right now with boot times dramatically faster than they ever achieved on Windows 10. Applications opening faster. The entire system more responsive than it was on the operating system that told it to retire. The realization this produces in users is one of the most powerful moments in the switching experience. The computer was never the problem. The operating system consuming its resources for background telemetry, update services, cloud sync processes, and AI monitoring was the problem. Remove those processes and the hardware reveals the capability that was always there. A 5-year-old laptop that Windows 11 declared obsolete becomes a fast, functional machine running Zorin Lite, often performing better than it ever did under Windows 10. Microsoft told people to throw those machines away. Zorin proved the machines were fine. The privacy experience that new Zorin users describe consistently has an emotional quality that goes beyond a feature comparison. It is described as relief. There is a specific psychological state that comes from using a computer that is not watching you, not collecting your behavioral data, not processing your activity to build an advertising profile, not running background processes whose purpose is to serve corporate commercial interests rather than your actual work. People who switch to Zorin from Windows 11 identify this state immediately, even when they struggle to articulate what has changed. The background awareness of being monitored, the low-level recognition that the operating system has its own agenda running parallel to yours, disappears. The computer executes your instructions, nothing else. No telemetry floor that cannot be lowered below a mandatory minimum. No advertising ID tracking your usage patterns across the Microsoft ecosystem. No AI assistant monitoring your workflow and consuming a gigabyte of RAM as a background process. No HUD drives silently redirecting your files. No Microsoft account requirements creating cloud dependencies you never requested. The machine does what you tell it to do and nothing else. For users who had normalized the surveillance architecture baked into Windows 11 as an unavoidable feature of modern computing, the discovery that it was specific to Windows rather than inherent to using a computer is transformative. And it makes returning to Windows feel like a conscious choice to accept monitoring rather than simply using the computer that happens to be available. Zorin's update model reinforces the ownership experience in a way that becomes immediately apparent to anyone who has experienced a Windows-forced restart, destroying unsaved work at a critical moment. Updates in Zorin happen when the user decides to run them. The operating system does not have its own update schedule that overrides whatever you happen to be doing. You run updates when it is convenient for you. They apply cleanly. If they do not, there are mechanisms to address that. But the update never interrupts your work without your permission. For users whose relationship with Windows updates had evolved from mild inconvenience to active anxiety, knowing that any given update might break audio drivers, reduce gaming performance, reset privacy settings, or install features you never requested, the simple predictability of Zorin's update experience is itself a form of trust that Windows has spent years making impossible to feel. The download surge following the Windows 10 end-of-life deadline was composed almost entirely of first-time Linux users. This is the statistical detail that makes the Zorin story genuinely significant rather than a redistribution of existing Linux users. The Zorin forums and community spaces filled with posts from people describing themselves as complete beginners, retired teachers, college students, parents trying to keep older family laptops functional, small business owners who could not justify new hardware purchases, people with no ideological interest in open source software and no prior exposure to Linux, who installed Zorin and found themselves operational without significant difficulty. The myth that kept Linux safely confined to developer workstations was not just weakened by this wave. It was publicly demolished by hundreds of thousands of real accounts from real, non-technical people describing their own experience of switching and finding it easier than expected. That word of mouth is more powerful than any marketing campaign Zorin could run or any technical argument Linux advocates could make. When a retired teacher tells her book club that her old laptop runs better than ever and that she gets no more advertising in her start menu and that setup was easier than she expected, 3 members of that book club file the information for the next time they face a frustrating Windows decision. When a college student shows 3 roommates that a budget laptop Microsoft declared obsolete is now fast and functional, those roommates remember the demonstration the next time they look at a Windows 11 machine running hot and slow with Copilot consuming a gigabyte of RAM in the background. The viral quality of Zorin's growth runs through exactly these demonstrations. It does not require Linux advocacy or open source philosophy. It requires showing people a computer that works better than the one they have been using. The broader ecosystem that Zorin users discover after switching is more capable than most Windows users expected Linux to be before they tried it. Web browsers run identically. Every web-based productivity tool, Gmail, Google Docs, Microsoft 365 Online, Slack, Zoom, Notion, Figma, operates in any browser on any operating system. The shift to browser-first workflows that happened gradually over the past decade eliminated the application dependency argument for Windows without most users noticing until they tried Linux, and found that 80% of their daily computing already happened in Chrome regardless of the underlying operating system. LibreOffice handles Microsoft Office file formats reliably for the majority of document workflows. DaVinci Resolve provides professional video editing free on Linux. The software availability gap that was a genuine barrier 5 years ago has narrowed to the point where it affects specialized professional workflows rather than ordinary daily computing for the vast majority of users. And gaming, which was the last serious structural argument for Windows exclusivity among mainstream users, has been dramatically transformed by Valve's Proton compatibility layer, bringing the majority of the Steam library to Linux with performance competitive with Windows on equivalent hardware. The industry signals surrounding this user-level migration reinforce the direction of travel. Dell has certified Linux on their most advanced AI hardware before Windows. Lenovo is expanding Linux availability across product lines. NVIDIA is investing significant engineering resources in Linux gaming infrastructure. The French government is migrating 2.5 million workstations. Germany's Schleswig-Holstein saved 15 million euros on a 30,000 workstation Linux migration. Enterprise departments are running total cost of ownership calculations that consistently favor Linux over Windows when licensing costs, support overhead, and update-related productivity losses are all included. The Zorin download numbers are the consumer surface of a shift that is happening simultaneously at every level of the computing ecosystem. Microsoft's available responses to this situation are constrained by exactly the business model that created the problem in the first place. The telemetry feeds the AI training and advertising systems that generate revenue. The forced cloud integration drives Azure subscription revenue. The Copilot embedding demonstrates the return on the OpenAI investment to institutional shareholders. The advertising in the Start menu generates incremental revenue from a surface that reaches 1 billion users. Each of the elements driving users toward Zorin serves a commercial function that Microsoft's current business architecture depends on. Removing them is not a product decision. It is a revenue decision with quarterly implications that Microsoft's financial commitments make genuinely difficult to absorb. Microsoft knows how to build a clean, respectful operating system. They build one for enterprise customers every day, providing configurations without advertising, with reduced telemetry, with local account options clearly presented. The decision to give ordinary consumers a different experience is a business choice, and it is a business choice that 800,000 people made their response to by downloading Zorin OS in a single release cycle. The pattern of Microsoft's response, more AI features, deeper cloud integration, more Copilot surface area, more ecosystem lock-in, reveals that they are reading the situation as a product gap rather than a trust gap. The framing assumes that users are leaving because Windows is missing something that a better feature set would provide. The actual reason users are leaving is that Windows stopped feeling like their property. It started feeling like a subscription they never agreed to, running on hardware they own, extracting value from their behavior for Microsoft's benefit. Adding more features to a platform people feel trapped by does not solve the trap. It demonstrates that the company running the platform does not understand why the trap is a problem. And Microsoft's business model makes genuine course correction, removing the monetization architecture that generates the trust-destroying user experience, nearly impossible without accepting revenue consequences that quarterly earnings calls make structurally difficult to absorb. Zorin did not steal Microsoft's users. It did not outmarket Windows or out-engineer it in ways that made switching an obvious competitive decision. What Zorin did was exist, mature, accessible, familiar, clean, and free, at the moment when Microsoft's own decisions made enough people frustrated enough to look for an alternative. The October 2025 deadline was not a Zorin marketing event. It was a Microsoft policy decision. The 800,000 downloads in a single release cycle are not a testament to Zorin's advertising budget. They are a measurement of the frustration Microsoft accumulated over years of treating ordinary users as a platform to be monetized rather than a customer base to be served. Zorin was positioned at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, because it had been building toward this moment for years, making the one design decision that no other Linux distribution was willing to commit to, building not for Linux enthusiasts, but for Windows refugees. Building not for users who wanted to explore Linux, but for users who wanted to escape Windows. That distinction, consistently applied across every design decision the platform makes, is why the bridge Zorin built was wide enough for 800,000 people to walk across it in a single release cycle. And the word of mouth those 800,000 people are now generating, through demonstrations to friends, through forum posts, through community accounts of real non-technical users navigating Linux without confusion, is the most powerful growth mechanism any platform can have. Not advertising, not technical superiority. Real people showing other real people that the thing they were afraid of turned out to be less scary than what they were running away from. That spreads. And it does not stop spreading because Microsoft releases another Copilot update.